If you clicked on this video, you're probably thinking about an individual who in times past has wronged you and you are struggling to forgive them. I want to let you know that you're not alone. In fact, according to Johns Hopkins Medical Research, 62% of Americans struggle with forgiveness in their personal lives. Jesus in the Bible, he addresses the danger of unforgiveness and he talks about the power of forgiveness. And I want to share with you 3 reasons why I believe you should forgive the individual and let them go. And I want to share with you how to do that. So the first one, the first reason or the first danger of unforgiveness and harboring grudges is that it erodes the harmony in your relationship with God. Truth be told, you cannot be at peace with God while still harboring a grudge, while still holding on to unforgiveness of an individual. The Bible says in 1 John, it is impossible. In fact, it is a lie to say that you love God, but who you don't see, but you hate people who you do see. There's an incongruency there. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 24, I just want to read this scripture. Jesus, he's talking about the Beatitudes, or he's talking about the behaviors of a Christian, how a Christian ought to live. And one of the things he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 24, he talks about interpersonal relationships. He says this in 23. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. So Jesus himself is saying, look, if you have unforgiveness, don't try to spiritualize your way through it. Don't try to sweep it under the rug with spiritual practices such as making an offering to God or, praying and reading and going to church. All of those things are great. But at the core, Jesus wants us to forgive because he understands that unforgiveness, it erodes our relationship with him. Well, you say, well, how does it erode our relationship with him? Well, because number 2, if you hold on to unforgiveness, it actually creates a negative impact to your mental health. Now, again, this is by Johns Hopkins research. They say that people who hold on to grudges and hold on to unforgiveness, they are more likely to deal with severe depression. So in other words, harboring unforgiveness actually creates it makes us depressed. Well, you say, well, how is that the case? Because we kind of relive and we rehearse the offense that transpired, right? Like we kind of relive moment by moment, day by day, how exactly the person wronged us, right? We think about what the words that they said that were so offensive, or we think about the behavior and the actions that they have done that has caused this offense. So sometimes when we relive, or sometimes when we hold on to unforgiveness, we tend to relive the moment and we tend to hold on and to nurse that moment and we continue to replay that moment. And honestly, friends, it's torment to the soul. And what you're doing by holding on to the grudge, what we tend to do is we're actually negatively impacting our mental health. Our mental capacity was not designed in a way for us to constantly rehash and go over and mull over how we were offended and how we were hurt. Now, I do want to stop to say that what I'm sharing does not minimize the pain and the trauma that comes with the offense, but it is to say that we need to stop torturing ourselves. We need to get to a point where we actually release them and release it and we move forward. Because the truth be told, sometimes while we are tormenting ourselves by reliving the moment, the offender is not even thinking about the offense that they have created. And so it's kind of like that popular quote related to unforgiveness that says, unforgiveness is like handing somebody poison, right? Or drinking poison. That's what it is. It's this idea that you are thinking that you are doing you're inflicting harm on an individual by being angry, by withholding love, by withholding connection, by withholding whatever, you think that you're damaging that individual, not really realizing you're damaging yourself. There has been so many diseases that have been linked back to depression, like Alzheimer's, for example, is one, has been linked back to severe depression. Johns Hopkins says, look, that people who hold on to grudge, they are more likely to have severe depression. So if you think about it, it makes sense why Jesus says, hey, you go reconcile with the offender. You go reconcile with the other party. In other words, you forgive them and you let them go so that you can re-engage with me. Because the truth is told that if we continuously hold on to the grudge, we make that person and we make that thing an idol. And I don't mean it from the sense of idol like, oh, you are struggling with lust kind of idol. I mean it from the standpoint of we just make that person in that situation bigger than God. We allow that situation or that person to take up too much space in our hearts and in our minds to the point where God has no room to operate, where the Holy Spirit has no room to influence. And so we have to forgive so it creates space for God to come and heal. As I'm actually thinking about it and talking about it, I remember growing up and my dad will always say this when I used to get angry at either my brothers. He would always say, Sam, every single time you allow someone to offend you, you give up your agency and you give up your power. And that is so true, that unforgiveness is actually giving somebody else the ability to control your emotions, giving them the ability to control and to govern your life, to be honest. And honestly, it creates sideways energy. What is sideways energy? Unproductive energy. So how about you reclaim your power? How about you reclaim your agency by letting them go, by forgiving and letting go? So Jesus says again in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 and 24, before you do any spiritual activities, you should solve this in the natural. Why should you solve it in the natural? Because according to Johns Hopkins research, listen, you are more likely to be more severe when you hold, or more likely for severe depression rather, when you hold on to grudges and you rehearse the offenses. The last reason why unforgiveness is dangerous, honestly, and this one is very subtle, is that it indirectly sabotages your other relationships. It indirectly sabotages your other relationships. Truth be told, when we are offended, at least when I'm offended, or at least when I'm holding on to a grudge, chances are we tend to generalize. Then we start to make generalistic statements like all people move like this, like all people are weird. People may say like, hey, all men are dogs, or, women can't be trusted, right? These are statements that we have heard maybe our family members say throughout the years. And we think that these are just random statements, but these are statements that have been rooted in offense and unforgiveness. And the truth be told is that offense and unforgiveness, while it started with one person, it is now impacting multiple people because you're indirectly sabotaging good relationships because you experience a bad relationship. And so I want to encourage you to think about the fact that, hey, unforgiveness is not just a isolated event. You can't just compartmentalize unforgiveness. You can try, but you really can't. Because what unforgiveness creates in the human soul is these mile markers, which turn into warnings, which turn into triggers, and these triggers turn into defenses. These defenses limit healthy relationships. That's what I'm saying. That we kind of tout this thing, especially in 2024, in this era, we tout this idea of, hey, I don't want to be triggered. And truthfully, you shouldn't want to be triggered. But I always tell people triggers are not something to try and control other people with. Triggers are meant for you to confront and for you to get better at. So in other words, we using triggers to say, hey, can you not say this around me because I'm triggered? That's not the point of the trigger. The point of the trigger is for you to have self-awareness, for you to know, hey, this thing is eliciting old memories. This thing is eliciting, is bringing me back to a negative space, and I need to pivot in these moments. I need to pull out my toolkit. I need to do what I need to do to make sure I can present and be the most healthy version of myself in this moment. And so when we hold on to grudges and when we have unforgiveness, friends, we're actually sabotaging indirectly other relationships. And these relationships are probably healthy. How do we do that? One, because it skews our perception. When we don't forgive and let people go, it kind of actually skews our perception of people, right? Because it causes us, because we're not confronting the offense and we're sweeping it under the rug, it causes us to view people in that way because we've now given up our agency. You know, agency is a powerful word. It's a powerful concept. And agency is something that happens on an indirect level. It happens in a very subconscious way. And it happens in a subconscious way. So what I mean by that is, if I do not forgive an individual, I am subconsciously giving up my agency. I'm giving up my ability to make the decision to forgive this individual. And when I abdicate that responsibility, when I abdicate that right, subconsciously, I'm training my mind that in the next relationship or in my other relationships, I automatically become and feel inferior. I'm gonna get it out. I feel inferiority complex. I feel this level of I have no agency in healthy relationships because I gave up my agency in a toxic relationship. Because of my inability to forgive, I gave up that agency. So my mind is conditioned and trained to automatically feel subservient in all my other relationships. And when I feel subservient in all of my other relationships, I then tend to lash out for control, thus making that healthy relationship unhealthy. Get? So those are 3 reasons. Again, number 1, it erodes your relationship with God. Number 2, it leads to severe depression because it negatively impacts you. And then number 3, it indirectly sabotages other relationships. So now that we talked about why we should forgive, I think the real question is then, how should I forgive? I want to actually conclude with a longer passage from Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7 verses, I'm going to read 40 to 47. Now, I encourage you to not click off. I encourage you to stay so you get the how. Because the how is just as important as the why. And in this passage, in these 7 verses, Jesus gives us a very powerful blueprint to forgive and let people go. Because, forgiving and letting people go is actually not an easy thing at all. I'm kind of talking as if it's easy, but we know this is easier said than done. Because you have to overcome real feelings. You have to overcome real emotions. You have to overcome real perceptions. You have to overcome real trauma. You have to overcome real, internal wrestling. But Jesus gives us the tools and the equipment to take our agency and to be able to forgive and let go. And I just want to share this in Luke chapter 7, verse 40 to 47. It says, "And Jesus answered him, 'Simon, I have something to say to you.' And he replied, 'Say it, teacher.'" I don't know why I said it like that, but "Say it, teacher." It's kind of like the old preachers. And then when they read and then they have somebody read for them and they say like, "Well," so that's kind of what came to mind. But anyways, verse 41, "A money lender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. So which one of them will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, you have judged correctly. Now let's just stop there. So Jesus is using this parable. A parable is sort of like a metaphor in order to explain a larger point. So Jesus is saying there's a situation where there's a guy, a money lender, or a guy, he gives out money to two people. One he gives $500 to, the other he gives $100 to. They both cannot repay him. The money lender says, cool, no problem. I forgive you of your 500. I forgive you of the 100. Jesus says, which one would be more grateful? The one that was forgiven for 500 or the one that was forgiven for 100? Simon says, the one that was forgiven for 500. I mean, that makes sense. Why does that make sense? Because the one that was forgiven for 500 was forgiven a more weightier debt, right? 500 is more than 100. So, wow, I can see you forgiving me of $100 because you can recoup that. But $500, that's not a small thing. So that's what Jesus is saying here. And that's the conversation that Simon and Jesus is having. Okay. Now, verse 44, turning towards the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Verse 45, you gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with perfume. Verse 47, for this reason I say to you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. Now, in all of that, what is Jesus saying? Well, what Jesus is describing here and what is happening in this text is Jesus is saying, hey, look, I came into your house and you all, my disciples, were not hospitable at all. And the reason probably why they weren't hospitable is because they were familiar with Jesus. Like, I know Jesus, I walk with Jesus, I have access to Jesus. So therefore, I don't really need to be hospitable. And we kind of know this. Like, when we have friends who are like more like associates come over, we bring out the good silverware. We make sure the house is super clean. But if your siblings come over, you don't care if the house looks like a tornado. You don't care if it looks like a mess, because it's like, bro, I've seen you at your worst, so you can't judge me, right? But when you're dealing with friends, you're like, I gotta make sure I tidy up here because I don't want them to judge me, right? Well, that's what Jesus is saying. Because the disciples and the Pharisees and Sadducees, because they have access to Jesus, they don't treat him with the same value that they ought to treat him. But then there was a woman. Then there was a woman who felt and knew that she was unqualified. Not only did she feel and she also knew that she was unqualified, the people around her affirmed the fact that she was unqualified to be in the presence of Jesus. But yet she found herself in the presence anyways. Come on. I just need to stop to say that for somebody, that you may feel unqualified, but yet God is going to qualify you, because it's God who qualifies the unqualified. It's God who qualifies the call, right? But anyways, I digress. Jesus says this woman who feels unqualified, who knows she's unqualified, and people have affirmed that she's unqualified, she has been the most hospitable to me. She has treated me based off of my value. Question is, why was she able to do that? It was a mentality thing. Jesus says, because she knows that her sins are much and she has been forgiven much. And I think that if you and I are going to forgive and let people go, you have to remind yourself of what you have been forgiven by. And that right there, my friends, is called grace. That right there is called a game changer. When you think about the fact of what you have been forgiven of, it should motivate and propel you to forgive others, y'all. And that's really the whole point. That the way we kind of override the pain and the hurt and the trauma of the offense is by understanding that you probably have offended somebody to that same degree and to that level. Now, culture would say like, well, you're minimizing the situation because you're comparing two that should not be. I'm not comparing it. What I'm simply saying is when we are grateful for the forgiveness that we receive on a daily basis, it fuels and propels us to forgive others as well. So I want to encourage you, before you reach out to the individual, before you even say a word or try to make up in your mind whether or not you should forgive, can you just take a moment to think about how much you have been forgiven of? And just thank God for how much you have been forgiven of. And watch, if you take that sincerely, you'll find yourself having a bigger heart and a larger heart to forgive and to let go of the offender. God bless you. I love you.